The Lord be with you.
With your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to the Lord.
Jesus said to the Pharisees, There was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen and dined sumptuously each day. And lying at his door was a poor named Lazarus, covered with sores, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. Dogs used to come and lick his sores. When the poor man died, he was carried away by angels to the bosom of Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. And from the netherworld where he was in torment, he raised his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he cried out, Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am suffering torment in these flames. Abraham replied, My child, remember that you received what was good during your lifetime, while Lazarus likewise received what was bad. And now he is comforted here, whereas you are in torment. Moreover, between us and you, a great chasm is established to prevent anyone from crossing who might wish to go from our side to yours or from your side to ours. He said, Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so he may warn them, lest they too come to this place of torment. But Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. He said, Oh, no, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. Then Abraham said, If they will not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded by someone who should rise from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So one thing I need to say right off the bat, because half of you are sitting on top of them, is you'll notice I put Samaritan magazines into the pews. And like I said, if you're sitting tight to the aisle, you're sitting on top of them. But I have copies there, and since you might hear me yelp when I get outside going, whoa! Because this is my last of 19 Mission Appeal weekends, this Mass. And I've been on the road since June 5th. And I get to sleep in my own bed day after tomorrow night. And I actually was down in Florida, not only last week, but I was down in February, March, after being in Baton Rouge, Louisiana twice. But the big thing is this magazine is something Marion has been putting out since our foundation. It actually started under another name before we were even founded. And we older types might remember getting it in the mail or in our Catholic schools, especially if we're Northeastern transplants. And it was a monthly, now it's a quarterly, but it's important because this is one of the ways we've communicated for 114 years since we were founded, along with these weekend mission appeals. And back in the days when there were lots of Catholic schools going into Catholic schools, which was my first exposure to Maryknoll. One of the reasons for these weekends is because Maryknoll is kind of unique. Unlike most groups that I'm aware of, and we are the Catholic Foreign Mission Society of America, and until recently we only accepted vocations from the US with a loophole for Canada, but we have no parishes in the United States, we have no high schools or universities as a source of vocations or a source of funding, or even to let people know who we are and what we do, except for these visits and the magazine. So since this is the last weekend, please take these, because I'll leave them in the pews so they clutter up your church for the next couple of weeks if you don't take them now or soon. And I've got some outside, so if I see you going out that door, if you want, you can cut out this door. I will accost you if I don't see somebody in your family having a magazine in their hand. So, and this is Ryan's wife, I take it. And the one son and the 9-month-old daughter, that's it? Okay, hey Ryan, I got to meet them all now. But anyways, Maryknoll still is, the Catholic Foreign Mission Society of America, founded in 1911, basically because the U.S. bishops and our two co-founders, one being from next door in North Carolina, said it's time for the church in the United States to have its own mission society, because 3 years prior, the Vatican said the U.S. church is no longer a mission-receiving church, because now we're self-sufficient in clergy and in religious. That's not the case anymore, because like last week I was with a priest from India, and a couple of weeks ago with one from Africa. So we're a mission-receiving church again. I could go into a whole spiel on that one, but I'll spare you. But the big thing is this idea of doing mission. And I've been in Maryknoll since earlier this month for 46 years. I've been a priest almost 40. And as I started to say, I was a missionary in Egypt for 20 years and in Kenya for 4. And coming from a little town called Boston, New York, and I won't get into that one either, but it was a dairy farm town. My grandfather was a dairy farm. My father was a partner in the local lumber business. And I went to a 4-room school for 8 years. We had 2 grades in every room. So my sense growing up in Western New York was, this is America. It was a little bit like Walton's Mountain, if you ever saw the Waltons on TV. Anyway, to get into it, Maryknoll first went to the Orient, and we went to mainly China, Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. Second World War comes around, we get tossed out of those countries, so we start going into Latin America and into Africa. And then after the Second World War, because men had seen how ugly and destructive in terms of life and property war could be, both in Europe and the Pacific, so we got inundated to the point where you wouldn't believe how many buildings we expanded. But anyway, we were ordaining 50 to 55 a year. Now we're lucky if we do 1 or 2, but we still do the best we can. But the 30 countries where we were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s is now down to 15. But we still are engaged in primary evangelization as well as corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And some of that, again, is talked about in the magazine. I myself, coming from that small town, went to local high school, Hamburg High in Western New York. And then I wasn't sure what I wanted to do right after high school, so I went into the Air Force from 68 to 72. And I'll maybe touch on this towards the end, but at the same time, my cousin had graduated from Syracuse University, and this is the middle of the Vietnam War, and he said, I'm not going to volunteer, but I'll go if I'm drafted. He got drafted, and about the same time, after a year in the States, I got sent to Germany. Thanks to a landmine, my cousin's name is on panel 20W of the Vietnam War Memorial, along with a Maryknoll priest on the other side of the memorial. And as luck would have it, I actually did a mission appeal in a parish where the cemetery is where my cousin Dave is buried. But that affected my life, but I'll touch on that a little later. Anyway, come back from the Air Force, go to college, and then I actually ended up by going back to Germany because I had a small job on a little horse farm, because I grew up with horses in Western New York, in Germany along with the Air Force. But when I went back after college, then I went back to the horse farm and also got a job in a hotel. From there, got recruited to work in a hotel in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates right next to Dubai. This is the end of the 70s, and it was much not the way it is now when you think about Dubai. And, but the reason why I touch on this is because one of our earliest Maryknollers, and he was in the first group to go to China somewhere around 1914 or so, but his name was James Edward Walsh from Cumberland, Maryland. He wrote a little book called Portrait of a Missioner. And he said to be a missioner, you can never lose your little boy's sense of adventure. And even at 76, I think I still got it. But you know, when I was a kid, and this goes back to the bicycle accident, starting at 11, I was riding a 3-speed Schwinn, on up to 100-mile bike hikes and stuff like that. And I had a 3-story tree house in my friend's backyard, all sorts of shenanigans with that. I had a cabin up in the woods, taught myself how to drive at 11 with a 1949 Ford on my grandfather's farm. None of that's gone away. I still have this little boy sense of adventure. And this is one of the things, because in this day and age, we become so comfortable with our Wi-Fis and our cell phones and our TVs. I'm wondering if anybody does what I did as a kid anymore, because it really does set you up for the missions. So anyway, I joined Marino in 1979, and I go to Egypt first as a seminarian, then back in 1986 as a priest. Been back and forth about 4 or 5 times, and I still go back every single year for at least a month. And I could talk about Kenya, but I'm looking at this little clock, which I haven't noticed up until now. And one of the things they say, and I'm going to break the rule, they say every minute you go over 10 minutes, you lose $100 in the collection. But I'm going for 15. I'm going for 15, so if I lose $500, so be it. I usually get the mass done in an hour still. But the big thing is, Egypt is incredible. It has more than its share of problems over the centuries, but you don't go there to bring Jesus. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph lived there. And you don't go there to start a Christian community. One of the oldest Christian communities, founded by Mark the Evangelist, has been there since the 1st century. So you go there to support Christians being Christian and Catholics being Catholic. As Christians, and this is not to preach against Islam, I have too much respect and I have too many Muslim friends. And unfortunately, we're given such a bad negative picture of Islam here, but that's a whole other subject again. But you know, one of the things we don't understand is because Muslims don't understand Christianity. And we don't go to convert Muslims into Christians so much as to convert attitudes, because no one converts religion until their attitudes change, including our own. But they see us as mushrikun. And the worst sin you can commit in Islam is the sin of shirk, which is idol worship and polytheism. And you have to invade their space to give them a chance to make comments so you can give them their answers, especially after studying Islam for a couple of years and living with Muslims for over 20. So this idea of shirk, multiple gods, we have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Trying to explain the Trinity is tough, but I do my best. And then the next thing is idol worship, and we've got statues and icons and stained glass windows with idols and white bread that we go like this to with incense. And so you have to try to explain all this stuff, so at least they don't look at us as the biggest sinners according to Islam in terms of polytheism and idol worship. And then we're considered the original Protestants and heretics by the Orthodox. So we get a double whammy as Catholics, and they're mainly Eastern Catholics, Copts and Chaldeans and Maronites and Melkites, Armenians and Syrians, along with their much larger Orthodox counterparts. Well, one of the jobs I had was being part of formation education at the Coptic Seminary for 10 years. I got involved in forming and educating about 100 seminarians. Marino, with your help, kicked in a lot of money to renovate the classrooms in different parts, because the desks, you could be writing on a piece of paper, your pen or pencil would go through a hole in the desktop. And just this idea of being part of an ancient church and helping them continue. And I still visit them and check on them spiritually and financially and emotionally to see how they're doing. And I still help them, personally, as well as some of the projects they're still having. Again, with, help from you and my own parents' personal inheritance, among other things. And another example of a project, for instance, Anton Cabas. He was actually a professor I met way back in '84, but he was building, and he stalled out because of lack of funds, and I filled in the blanks on that one. But Our Lady of Peace Home for Special Needs, which just celebrated its 21st anniversary. It's now self-supporting, and for over 20 years now, it's been housing special needs kids, mainly autism and Down syndrome and a few other issues, and cohabitating with the Good Samaritan Home, which is basically more or less an orphanage, but it's not because their parents are deceased, it's because their parents can't afford to keep all the kids, so they drop them off and we get them until they're about 18 and then they're sent off to go to school or to get a job or do whatever. Some of the residents in terms of the special needs have been there ever since I was there, and I'm thinking of Atiyat and a few of the others who I always reunite with every time I go back. And then there's another project, and I could go on and on and on, but I'm still looking at that clock. And one is Buddhist Nasif, who was one of my earlier seminarians, with Abu Khair, one of my later ones, and they're Coptic Rite Catholic parish priests in Minia. And they also are both involved in prison ministry. And the reason why I always bring this one up, excuse me, is because they're working with 2 Muslim sheikhs and 2 congregations from these 2 mosques. And in the beginning they said, look, we're never going to agree on Jesus, and there's some other issues that we're dealing with, but we're going to table those and focus on our Creator God called us to serve the widow, the orphan, the oppressed, and for instance, the imprisoned. I believe it was in the Psalm today. And they become friends over the years. And they even demonstrate together when there's an area with sectarian violence that blows up, and it blows the minds of the riders because they're going, I don't understand this. We got Christians and Muslims holding arm in arm, Muslim sheikhs and Catholic priests, and some are holding signs saying, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Messiah, I'm a Muslim, I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm Egyptian. Maybe we could do the same thing. And I could go into all the ramifications of that. This is the first time I noticed this clock, so I'm running over as it is. But the big thing is, and then the Waha Center, which is one of my newer projects, and that's where my ashes go when I die, but it's, Waha is the Arabic word for oasis, and it's where people go to run away from abusive family situations. Wives very often with their kids. It's a counseling center where we train counselors to go into the villages to basically try to head some of these issues off at the pass, as well as a retreat center and a youth renewal center, things like that. This is just a little bit of what I've done. And we've got, I could talk about Bob Butch, a brother who worked with Hansen's disease, leprosy patients, as a shoemaker for 15 years in Egypt and 4 or 5 years in China. But I gotta stop. But one thing, and this is where I shoot myself in the foot, not only because I'm going over time, but because it's a controversial subject. And I haven't got time to get into the details. But I believe this parish, or maybe the diocese, had a collection for Gaza not too long ago. And I worked with the peacekeeping forces in Sinai, and I was in Jerusalem the last 3 weeks of the first Gulf War. The way our politicians, our press, and our evangelical preachers have misled us, outright lied to us, and for what it's worth, your governor, who was the president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, out of the 14 of my life, was the only president of the United States who sincerely wanted a true peace in the Holy Land. Nobody else has before him or since. And that's something you get in touch with. He was a truly Christian president who wanted peace with justice. And again, I could go into that long, 2 hours without taking a breath. But the one thing I'd ask you, since you might be interested because of that collection, is there's a film out, and it's mainly about Christians in the West Bank, and Christians are Palestinian. It's called The Stones Cry Out, and it's a 55-minute video. It's very informative, very accurate from my experience, and it's worth you watching, because over the 77 years, we have thrown $330 billion at Israel. It hasn't produced security for Israel. It's still the most dangerous place in the world to be a Jew. And it definitely hasn't produced justice or peace for Palestinians. And I could get into that whole subject too. Because I've seen it, I've read about it, and I've studied it for 48 years, almost 50. And I know what I'm talking about, but I won't have time again. But this film is worth seeing because it really gives you at least a background and hopefully creates some kind of curiosity and doubt where you need to learn more. Our lives have been so affected, everything from security at the airport to what we pay to put gas in our tanks. And it's all been unnecessary because we have never seriously tried to tackle this issue and solve it the way Jesus would when it comes to justice and peace, having to go together like in Psalm 85. So with all that said, I apologize for talking a little too long, and I'll mention that film again at the end, as well as to take a magazine when you leave. But now we can stand and profess our faith.